While there are a number of misconceptions in the criminal justice system, the myth I chose to discuss for this presentation was that longer prison sentences deter crime. I, as well as many criminal justice scholars, do not believe that longer prison sentences deter crime. Rehabilitation and other forms of deterrence should be better utilized to prevent crime. As a result of long prison sentences, inmates and their families struggle with human rights considerations, poverty, public health, societal impact, and the cost of imprisonment. In this section, I will discuss why I decided to choose the topic. I decided to choose the misconception of longer prison sentences deterring crime because it is an issue that is often discussed in the criminal justice system but has little policy to show for it. There are so many problems that revolve around the prison system. Inmates who are serving long sentences will ultimately be affected by these problems the most. Issues that arise in the prison system include the ones previously mentioned above and less insignificant ones that go unnoticed. The less urgent issues include bad food, visitation, and insufficient activities. These less significant issues get pushed aside because of the overwhelming big ticket issues. I believe that there are other means to deterring crime than imprisoning inmates for such a long period of time. Also, more opportunities need to be given to inmates, especially ones with long sentences, to succeed in society once they are released. Rehabilitation should focus on the correctional component of the criminal justice system. By focusing on ways to bring inmates back into society properly, recidivism rates will drop. I am also optimistic that by educating criminals and future criminals on crime, this will act as a deterrent effect to committing crime. This section will describe the myth. There are a few reasons why long prison sentences fail to work in the United States. 69% of released prisoners were later convicted of a different offense and sent back to prison. In the United Kingdom, 70% of released prisoners were arrested again within a year of their release. Many scholars and studies argue that reoffending is due to criminals thinking they will not get caught. As a result of criminals believing they are smarter than law enforcement, longer prison sentences will not deter them from committing the same or similar offense once they are released from prison. Another reason that longer prison sentences do not necessarily work is that there is not enough focus on rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is not traditionally emphasized in the United States correctional system for inmates who have long sentences. This is problematic because unless an inmate is serving a life sentence, rehabilitation would not be necessary to reintegrate them back into society. Even prisoners who are serving life sentences should have this opportunity. This opportunity should be afforded to inmates serving long sentences because their behavior in prison is still important and has an effect on other inmates. Although lifers have less freedom than other inmates, they still interact with the general population. Lifers interact with other inmates during rec time, chow time, and on other occasions. Rehabilitation could serve as a tool to make them less susceptible to act out in prison. Inmates who are serving life sentences are viewed as the most dangerous inmates in some cases because they have nothing to lose. This section will talk about the history of the myth. The history of the prison system dates back to the 1790s when Philadelphia implemented the first prison. Previously, the United States and other countries would use capital punishment for more severe crimes and hard labor for less significant offenses. Many citizens believed that the concept of prisons could not cure crime. This is when the Get Tough on Crime initiative began in the 1980s. President Nixon was the first president to raise concern by saying the solution to the crime problem is not the quadrupling of funds for any governmental war on poverty, but more convictions. As a result of the Get Tough on Crime initiative, the prison community was greatly affected. The initiative became intertwined with the war on drugs as it strived to implement stricter sentences for drug-related crimes. In addition, this also sparked the three strikes and you're out law, as well as the mandatory minimum sentences. As a result of this, criminals who have been convicted three times for the same offense would now receive a life sentence. Additionally, crimes that followed mandatory minimums presented a minimum number of years that offenders must serve before being considered for parole. The 1980s Get Tough on Crime initiative is what made the United States become unmatched in incarcerating criminals. As a result of getting tough on crime, the United States also started increasing the length of prison sentences. This section will talk about the current status of the myth. The current status of the misconception that longer prison sentences deter crime is that prison sentences are still longer than they should be. Crime is still occurring at an alarming rate. Despite the recent drop in crime, mass incarceration, lack of rehabilitation for inmates, and limited deterrent factors are all reasons against long prison sentences for inmates. These factors take away from the offender's human rights and chance to successfully reintegrate into society. Mass incarceration, lack of rehabilitation for inmates, and limited deterrent factors are all negative aspects to the effect of longer prison sentences. Mass incarceration is a consequential problem of longer prison sentences. More and more people are getting sent to prison as a result of it, regardless of the seriousness of their offense. Another issue that stems from mass incarceration is the overcrowding of prisons, which was mentioned above. As a result of prisons being overcrowded, the rights of inmates are being infringed upon by living in less than ideal conditions. Ideal conditions include inmates having adequate meals, sufficient personal space, and programs that help them rehabilitate and pass time. This section will talk about ethical issues of the myth. There are a number of ethical issues that surround privately run prisons. While the issue is not the price it costs to operate a private prison, but where is that money going? The undisputed issue is that privately run prisons are profiting on sentencing criminals to prison. Advocates for privately run prison systems are pushing legislative decisions to sentence criminals more strictly. As a result of the greed of these privately run prisons, longer sentences are being given out to ensure that beds remain filled. Mandatory minimum sentences and three-strike laws take discretionary power away from judges. Mandatory minimum sentences and three-strike laws have little or no effect on crime rates. By utilizing mandatory minimum sentences and three-strike laws, sentencing power is shifted from judges to the prosecutors. This allows prosecutors to impose unjust sentences that the court system can do little to override. Drug offenses, murder, aggravated rape, felonies involving firearms, and felonies committed by people who have previous felony convictions are the most common instances where mandatory minimum sentences are utilized. This section will discuss diversity issues in regard to the myth. The main diversity issue, which relates to the length in prison sentences, are racial disparities in the sentences. Racial disparities, as they relate to length in prison sentences, most greatly affect blacks and Hispanics. Throughout the criminal justice system, blacks and Hispanics are discriminated against as a whole. In regard to the correctional system, there are disparities between imprisonment, capital punishment, life sentences, and sentences of life without the possibility of parole for adults and minors. Mandatory minimum sentences, three strikes, truth in sentencing, and life without the possibility of parole, and similar laws are reasons why blacks and Hispanics are more greatly affected by the correctional system than whites. Blacks and Hispanics do commit crime at higher rates than whites. However, sentencing options are still disproportionate. In addition to inadequately being punished for offenses, Black and Hispanic people often are disproportionately arrested and convicted as well. After reviewing the evidence, it is a misconception that longer prison sentences deter crime. While incapacitation is important means of the correctional system, there are other ways to effectively deter crime. The criminal justice system needs to place emphasis on deterring crime through rehabilitation and correcting the behaviors of criminals. Furthermore, ethical issues in the correctional system are apparent and need to be discussed with more urgency. Finally, instances of racial disparities as they relate to blacks and Hispanics as opposed to whites, particularly males, in the correctional system are reasons for concern. Policymakers may want to take a longer and harder look at the misconception that longer prison sentences deter crime. This concludes my PowerPoint presentation.